Chapter 3, Legal and Ethical Aspects of Nursing. These are the clinical objectives for this section of the chapter. Okay, so you have three sources of law, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So that's your constitutional law. Constitutional law is law that's created by your legislatures, such as the Senate, the House. Federal and state laws are created by, um, by these entities. That's your legislative bodies. Also, your next source of law is your judicial law. So judicial law is judgment law. So when you have a judge that um, makes a decision over a particular case, then judges thereafter, that judge has set a precedent, and judges thereafter with similar cases in similar circumstances should be making decisions in a similar fashion, because the precedent has been set as to how those cases should be decided upon. And then your third source of law is administrative law. And so that's law that's created by agencies. So like your Department of Health and Human Services, that would be considered, administrative law, any laws that they would make. So constitutional law, judicial law, and administrative law are your sources of law. Okay, then you have civil and criminal law. The difference between civil and criminal law, you need to understand the difference. When we talk about civil law, that's people versus people. So, for example, one person hits your car, the others, and so that person then sues that person for damages to their car. So it's person versus person, and you could have to pay money. You might have to make a public apology. Um, maybe some rules get changed, because of it or whatever. Versus criminal law. Criminal law is people versus the government. And so with that one, um, you know, you can committed some type of, maybe you, I don't know, murdered someone or something, it's person versus the government. And so with that one, it's punishable by imprisonment. You could have prison time. In some states, even the death penalty. You might have fines placed upon you. You might have restrictions placed upon you. For example, if it was a DUI, maybe they restrict your license or something like that. So that's the difference when we talk about civil versus criminal law. Okay, so the Nurse Practice Act is where you find your scope of practice as a nurse. So RNs and LPNs, your scope of practice is found in the Nurse Practice Act. Remember, it's important that you understand what your Nurse Practice Act says because it defines what you can and cannot do as a nurse. Every state has their own Nurse Practice Act. You are currently learning the laws for Ohio and what your Ohio Nurse Practice Act says you can and cannot do. If you get licensed and then go to another state and have your license transferred to another state, then you need to find out what that state's Nurse Practice Act says you can and cannot do because it can be different for every state. Remember, ignorance of the law is not a defense in a court of law. You cannot say, oh, I didn't know the Nurse Practice Act said I couldn't do that. That will not hold up in a court of law. So you need to know what your Nurse Practice Act says, and you can find your Nurse Practice Act on the Ohio Board of Nursing's website. I have posted a link to Blackboard for you to go in and look at and kind of play around with it and start to see what things it says you can and cannot do based on your scope, based on your level of education as an LPN or RN. And so every state, like I said, every state has their own um, Nurse Practice Act, and so you would have to, go to their Board of Nursing to find out what their Nurse Practice Act says. Ours is located on the Ohio um, Board of Nursing's website. Okay, so upon graduation, once you graduate, you can't automatically call yourself a nurse. You have to, once you complete all the requirements of a nursing program, you then have to take and pass the National Council Licensure Examination, also known as the NCLEX exam. And so the NCLEX exam, it's designed to protect the public. It's designed for public safety. So what it says is, it doesn't say that, oh, you're an expert in every area um, of nursing that there is. What it says is you are capable and should be able to practice nursing in a safe manner and not go out on day one and kill somebody. It says that you're competent enough to, be able to practice nursing safely. So it's designed to protect the public, not you as the nurse, because we want to ensure that you're competent and able to safely provide uh, nursing care. So you uh, graduating from the LPN program will then be required to take the NCLEX PN examination. Okay, so as a student nurse, when you're in the clinical setting, you are held to the same standard as a LPN. So you're in the LPN program, so you are held to the same standard as an LPN. So when you're going into the clinical setting, you can't fall back on, oh, you know, if a mistake is made, it's all on my instructor. Yeah, your instructor has some accountability, but you are held liable too. And some legal action can be come against you too for not performing at the level that you should. So don't go and without your instructor performing tasks and you don't know what you're doing. You always need to make sure you consult your instructor before doing anything. You really shouldn't be doing anything without your instructor being present. I don't care if it's another nurse from the facility there or not. You shouldn't be doing anything without your instructor. Come prepared. Do your care plans. Make sure you review your medications and everything. Make sure you review procedures before you do them, because you still have some liability and some legal action can still be brought against you for performing inappropriately in the clinical setting. So again, that means you need to know the Nurse Practice Act and what you can and cannot um, do as an LPN, because like I said, you will be held to the same standard as another as an LPN would be held to, because these are still patients' lives that we're dealing with. So you can't say, oh, I didn't know what I was doing. I'm only a student. It's still a person's life. So you still need to know what you're doing. Okay, so what is professional accountability? So it's a commitment to stay current and knowledgeable. Healthcare and nursing are going to constantly change. You can't always assume that you know everything that there is to know about everything. Never stop learning. You should always continue to learn. Even when you graduate, that's why we have our continuing education hours that we have to complete every 2 years to get our license renewed, because we should always be continuing to learn, always adding to our knowledge base. If you're in a particular work in a particular area, make sure you're keeping yourself up on the skills for that area. You work in telemetry, you should know about telemetry and about how to care for those patients. So keeping your skills up, keeping your knowledge up, because you can be disciplined for providing incompetent care. And so be accountable for your learning, be accountable for your actions and the things that you do. If you do something that's inappropriate, own up to it, speak up and say something. If I give the wrong med, I need to speak up and say I gave the wrong med so that interventions can be put in place so that the least amount of harm can come to my patient. So I need to be accountable to that and speak up and say something as well. So keep your knowledge up, keep your skills up. Okay, delegation. What is delegation? We have actually a whole chapter where we're going to talk about delegation in depth and what you can and cannot delegate and how to delegate and things like that. But delegation is assigning duties or tasks to another individual. So it kind of frees you up as the nurse to be able to do some higher level tasks. So as an LPN um, in Ohio, remember I said nurse practice acts are different for different states. So if you go to another state, you might not be, LPNs might not be allowed to delegate in another state. But in Ohio, you as an LPN can supervise and delegate to unlicensed assistive personnel. So that would be your nursing assistants. It could be the housekeeping. It could be the unit secretary. But most of the time, it's going to be your nursing assistant. But so unlicensed assistive personnel, technicians. If you're the charge nurse in many long-term care facilities, they have charge nurses as LPNs, and so you might be delegating to other LPNs as well. So again, you can delegate to unlicensed assistive personnel, which is most of the time your nursing assistants, other LPNs, technicians, things like that. If you delegate a task, you're still responsible for the care. So you're still accountable. You can't delegate the accountability. So I delegate a task. I still need to supervise and ensure that that task is performed safely. Now, that doesn't mean I have to stand over the person and watch them do it, but I do need to ensure that that task was performed safely. Maybe I go back and check after the fact. I could directly watch them. I could go and read the chart to see that it was done safely and appropriately, but I need to ensure that that task that I delegate was completed appropriately and safely as well. You want to make sure, first of all, you understand what the law says the person can do. And then you want to understand what your facility says the person can do. So, for example, when we're talking about delegating to a nursing assistant, the law says that, a nursing assistant can take vital signs on a stable patient. However, some facilities, the facility can make stricter policies than the law, but they can't make them more lenient. So the facility could say, we don't allow our nursing assistant to take vital signs. So you need to understand what the law says that the person can do and what your facility actually allows as well. Make sure you're clear in your communication to them. Don't just say, go do the AM care for room 205 and 206 and then walk Miss Jones. No, be clear in your delegation what AM care you want me to do. After I've done that, what do you want me to do? So be clear. Don't just say, go get the blood sugar for this person. It's not for that aide to make judgment calls or assess or interpret the information. You need to specifically say if that blood sugar is less than 70, then you need to let me know immediately. If it's between 70 and 100, document it in the chart exactly what you want them to do. If you want them to ambulate the person, what time do they need to ambulate by? How far do they need to ambulate? Do they need to use a walker? Do they need to use a cane? Do you need any feedback from that? So be clear in your delegation. Make sure the person is knowledgeable. Yes, a aide should be able to use a Hoyer lift for a patient. But if you say, um, please get Miss Jones up via Hoyer lift, and that aide says, I've never used a Hoyer lift before, I'm not sure how to do it, and you say, figure it out, that's a problem. If that person is not familiar with that, then A, you need to find somebody that knows how to do it, or B, go with that person and train them and teach them how to do it appropriately so that it does get completed safely. So remember, you are still accountable or responsible for the care that's provided for a patient that you've delegated a certain task to. Okay, standards of care. So these are authoritative statements of the actions and behaviors that all nurses, regardless of your role, the population you serve, the specialty, or the setting that you might be in, these are expectations that all nurses are expected to competently be able to perform. And so the published standards can serve as evidence for standards of practice. And so in legal cases, they can determine whether the nurse performed correctly or not. So basically, standards of care provide a guideline for good nursing care. And so if you're in a legal setting, so in other words, if you're in a legal case or whatnot, they're going to look at what is the standard of care and did you fall below that standard of care to determine if you were negligent or not. Okay, so the state board of nursing, your state boards of nursing are responsible for disciplining nurses, RNs, and LPNs. And so you can be disciplined for fraud, criminal activity, negligence, violation of the Nurse Practice Act, disciplinary action by another board. So, say for instance, you um, are licensed by a real estate board and they discipline you, then the board of nursing can discipline you for that same um, act as well. Being incompetent, using drugs or alcohol. You could be disciplined by any for any of those things. Some of the things that they can do to you, the board can suspend your license. They can completely revoke your license. They can place fines upon you. They can put restrictions on your license. So sometimes one restriction, for example, um, you're not allowed to pass narcotics to patients or administer narcotics to patients is a restriction that could be placed upon you. When you talk about negligence, negligence is care that falls below the standard of care. So remember, I said those standards of care, they're going to look and see what the standard is. What would a prudent nurse of the same level of education should have done? So what was the standard of care that should have been performed? If you fell below that standard, that's considered being negligent. And then malpractice is negligence by a professional. So it's just simply malpractice is negligence by a professional. So in order to prove negligence, four things have to be present. They have to prove that you had a duty to perform something. Then they have to prove that you breached that duty. Then they have to prove injury occurred, and then they have to prove proximate cause. Proximate cause means because what you did, this injury occurred. So also keep in mind too, it's considered negligent to not report another professional's misconduct. Because so if you witness something or see something inappropriate misconduct, then it's your responsibility to report it because they're still putting other patients' lives at danger in danger. No, they're not your patients, but we have to be advocates for all patients. And also, if you witness your coworker or a professional coming in intoxicated, it's your responsibility to report it. You don't go and confront that person, but it is your responsibility to report it. And if you don't, it can be considered negligent because you allow other patients' lives to be put in danger by not reporting that. So keep that in mind. Make sure you keep your uh, knowledge and skills up because you don't want to be performing incompetent care. Make sure you're knowledgeable about the Nurse Practice Act because you can be disciplined for all these things. If you're ever called before the Board of Nursing for an investigation, take an attorney with you. Take somebody that know what they're doing. So because this is your license and you worked hard for it. All right, so remember I said you have to keep your knowledge up. So every 2 years you have to renew your license. 1 year is the RNs, the next year is the LPNs that have to renew their license. And so in order to renew your license, you have to have continuing education hours. Every state is different. So if you move to another state, you have to find out what their laws are regarding continuing education and how many continuing education hours you would require. But for Ohio, you need 24 continuing education hours, and at least one of those hours has to be in Category A. Category A is the law. So one of those hours have to be Category A. So, just keeping that in mind. There's a variety of ways you can get your continuing education. The Board of Nursing has some links to some continuing education. Your job may have some continuing education hours. There's different organizations, seminars, different things you can do to get those continuing educations. You have one waiver in a lifetime. So say for instance you were sick all year and didn't get a chance to get your continuing education hours in. You have one waiver for the lifetime. Once you use that waiver, you can't use it again. Okay, so these are just several other laws that affect the Nursing Practice Act. And we'll just briefly, discuss some here. OSHA, uh, discrimination, child abuse, sexual harassment, Good Samaritan, patient rights, HIPAA, patient safety goals, and consents and releases. Okay, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. Your OSHA laws are just regulations on handling infectious and toxic materials, radiation safeguards, and electrical equipment. Your facility should provide training on a regular basis to you regarding how to handle these materials and and what their policies and procedures are. And so, and where you can find those policies and procedures. So they should be able to, you should have orientation to that on a regular basis. Okay, so as a healthcare worker, you are a mandated reporter for child abuse and elder abuse. So child abuse and elder abuse. Um, you are a mandated reporter. So that doesn't mean you have to have proof that um, the abuse occurred. But if you are suspicious or have a suspicion about abuse, then you have to report it to the proper authorities. That doesn't mean you go and confront the parent or the caregiver or whatever and that you suspected. You don't go and confront them. You just report it to the proper authorities and they will conduct their investigation. If it comes back that you suspected it and didn't report it, then you can be held liable and something serious goes on or happens to that child or elderly person. Okay, so discrimination, that's basically making a decision or treating a person based on a class or group to which that person might belong, such as a race, religion, sex, or something like that. So obviously, discrimination is not um, allowed. It's illegal, and we should not be discriminating against our patients or um, our co-workers or anyone on the healthcare team or the patient's families or anybody. We should not be discriminating. We should be treating everyone with respect and dignity, no matter their religion, their race, their sex, their disease, their sexual orientation, or how they identify, or anything. We shouldn't be treating anyone any different um, based on those beliefs. Also, remember too, when you're interviewing employers, it's illegal for employers to ask you questions about that could potentially lead to what your race is or what your family orientation is or what your sexual orientation is. They're not allowed to ask you questions like that. And if it comes back that you didn't get a job because of one of those reasons, then you could potentially sue that employer for discrimination. Okay, so sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for favors, or other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. So sexual harassment is illegal, and you should not have to encounter sexual harassment from your coworkers, the healthcare team, or your patients. You should not have to encounter sexual harassment from your patients either. And so, if you do encounter sexual harassment, the first thing you need to do is, in no uncertain terms, let that person know that this is not acceptable and you are not okay with this, and they should stop immediately. And then the next step, you're going to go to your supervisor or whatnot, and then take it to put it in writing as well. If it is your supervisor that's doing the harassment, again, let them know that you're not okay with that, and they need to stop. And we have to take it a step further to their supervisor at that point. It is illegal for that to sexual harassment to be used against you for a condition of employment or a promotion or anything like that. That is illegal. Okay, so the Good Samaritan law. The Good Samaritan law protects a person from liability. They're outside the work environment and they stop in an emergency to help someone. So, for example, you see a car accident on the street. You go over to help. The person in the car needs CPR. You perform CPR. You save that person's life. In the process of saving their life, you crack a rib. The Good Samaritan law protects you from them coming back and suing you saying you cracked my rib. So that's the Good Samaritan law. However, there are some conditions. When we're talking about Good Samaritan law, you are held accountable based on the level of your education. So that means you still cannot practice outside your scope of practice. So a nurse or LPN is held to a higher standard than a layperson. RN is held to a higher standard than an LPN, and obviously a physician is going to be held to an even higher standard. So you cannot be practicing outside your scope of practice. Say you work in a surgery um, area, and you've seen the physician perform tracheostomies a million times. You know how to do it. You've seen it. You cannot be out there cutting people and performing tracheostomy just because you know they need it and you've seen it done. You are not, uh, that is not within your scope of practice to do that. And so if you do a tracheostomy on someone and out there, and they can come back and sue you because that's not in your scope of practice to do that. So you are held to the accountable based on your level of education. Another thing, say the person comes back, they're so grateful. Oh, I'm so grateful you saved my life. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for saving my life. Here, let me give you this money as a token of my appreciation. And you say, thank you. I'll accept it. Good Samaritan law is out the window. If you accept payment or gifts, then you've been compensated for your services, and the Good Samaritan law is null and void. So it would behoove you to say, "Oh, thank you so much, but no, thank you. I can't take that." Also, if you start helping somebody, then you have to stay until another qualified individual comes in to relieve you. So likely that would be EMS or something like that. All right, so patient rights. Patients have certain rights, um, when it comes to healthcare. And so with the patient right document, it seeks to preserve the patient's dignity, privacy, freedom, of movement and information needs. So it says a few things. It says the person has a right to high quality care. They have a right to to a clean, safe environment. They have a right to involvement in their care. They have a right to protection of their privacy. They have a right to help, having help when they're leaving the hospital, and they have a right to have help with their billing claims. And so those that's what the patient rights document says. Okay, so the National Patient Safety Goals, these are updated every year. They're found on the Joint Commission. You can find them on the Joint Commission's website, but I have posted a link in Blackboard for you to access it. And so what it does, it identifies problem areas and evidence-based practices or evidence-based ways to deal with those problems that have been identified as the top issues. And what they're trying to do is prevent sentinel events. And sentinel events are expected or not expected, unexpected um, events that occur that cause serious injury to a patient. They cause death or they cause some type of serious injury physically or psychologically to that person. And so that's a sentinel event. And so these things are used to try to prevent sentinel events. Like I said, I've posted it on Blackboard for you to look at. Like, for example, one of the uh, areas that have been identified as a problem is identifying patients correctly. And so that's where we get the evidence-based practice that we use, that we have to have the two identifiers to identify patients before we do anything, before we give meds, before we do a treatment, before we do anything with that patient. So we have those two identifiers. So for example, that's why when you go in, you ask patient their name and date of birth. That's one of the first things you do is asking patient name and date of birth. And so that's done, like I said, to make sure the person is getting the right medication, the right treatment, or whatever. But you can kind of go through there and see what has been identified as problems and what evidence-based practices have been identified to alleviate those issues. Okay, so the medical record, that's a legal document that includes all the patient's information, their assessments, their tests, the care they've received, any lab tests, any nurses' notes, physicians' notes, all the discipline notes, everything, your face sheet, everything is where you can go to access all that. That's where the medical record, you can access all that information. Only people directly involved in the patient's care can access that medical record. So the healthcare team that's involved in the patient's care can access it. Uh, if I were the nurse working at the hospital and my husband got admitted to that hospital, I do not have access to that patient's chart because that's my patient, that's my husband. I still have to go through the proper protocols. Um, so my husband will have to, um, sign consent for me to be able to have access to that medical record. And then I still can't go and just take it off the shelf or whatever, or go if it's electronic, go in the chart. I still can't do that. I still have to go through the proper process of being able to see it. And so, that person, the patient can, allow, somebody to have access, but, it doesn't matter if it's your wife, your child, or whoever, the patient still has to provide approval. Also, you as a student nurse going in. So you're assigned to a patient, so then you have direct care over that patient. So then you have access to that patient's chart because you're assigned to that patient. But that doesn't mean you go and share that patient's chart with your classmates because they're not assigned to that patient. So they can't, access that patient's chart. Um, if you took care of a patient a week ago and you just want to know how they're doing today, you don't have access to that patient's chart because you're not providing direct care for them now. Just because you took care of them a week ago, that doesn't matter. So only people that are directly involved in the care of that patient, providing care for that patient, can access the patient's medical record. Okay, HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, is HIPAA. So originally HIPAA was designed for people to be able to transport their insurance from one entity to the next. But when we got into all this electronic documentation and everything being computerized, it started more focusing on patient privacy with the electronic medical records and things like that. And so now when you ask somebody what HIPAA is designed for, um, they will say patient privacy because that's been the main focus of it now is patient privacy. And so what that means, like I said, everything's electronic. So we have to do things to protect the privacy of our patients and their protected health information. If, for instance, if our MAR, medication administration record, is electronic and we're administering medications, we need to lock that screen before we walk away from that screen so no one can walk past and read a person's patient information on that screen. If you should have passwords to access, and your passwords, if you're in a hospital, your passwords should only provide access to whatever you need. So, for instance, a lab person will only need access to be able to input the person's lab. They don't need access to the person's entire chart. So your password should only allow certain access based on what you need for that patient. And you should not ever give your password out to anyone. Most places will have security measures in place where you have to change that password every so often. But remember, you're never going to give your password out to anyone. And so we need to be protecting patient privacy. Don't leave information laying on the desk, when you're for people to walk by and see patient information or whatever. So just be careful and cognizant of that. It doesn't just apply at work. It applies when you're not at work. You shouldn't be talking to people on social media, your patients, or your current patients, your past patients. You shouldn't be talking to people on social media or anything like that either. Um, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so consent gives permission to treat a patient. So you got different types of consent to treat different things. Anytime we're going to have an invasive procedure of a person, you need informed consent. And so informed consent means the patient is knowledgeable of the pros and cons of the treatment. And so the person that's actually doing, like I said, is for an invasive procedure. When we're talking about informed consent, it's for an invasive procedure. So the person that's performing the procedure, so likely the surgeon or whoever's performing that procedure, is the person that's going to be responsible for getting informed consent. The nurse is not the person responsible for getting the informed consent. It's the person that's doing the procedure. And so there's some certain things that the informed consent must contain. It must contain the risk and the benefits of the proposed treatment, the possible consequences of not having the procedure done, what are the alternatives to the treatment, the name of the healthcare professional that's going to be performing the procedure as well. So informed consent has to include, all of those things. Like I said, alternatives. So if I don't get this treatment, then what other things are out there or available for me to do? If I don't get it, what would be the consequences of me not having this procedure? And so they sign that, and then that they assume the risk, right? So that's they assume the risk of these are the consequences I've said that could possibly happen, and I've signed it saying I still want the procedure. So if one of those things happen, then they can't come back and sue and say, oh, this happened during surgery. Well, you assume the risk when you sign that informed consent. Okay, so a release is when you release someone from liability. So particularly like with leaving against medical advice. So I'm advising you to stay in the hospital, and then you're insistent, no, I'm leaving right now. I'm leaving right now. So you have that person sign um, a form that's a leave against medical advice form, which releases the hospital and the healthcare providers, releases them from liability should something go wrong after you leave the institution or the facility. Okay, when we talk about witnessing wills or legal documents, it is legal to witness the wills or legal documents, but most hospitals and healthcare entities have policies against witnessing wills and legal documents because um, if it gets contested, then you could be called to court to testify in that case if you were a witness on that legal document. Okay, advanced directives. So we have our living wills and our durable power of attorney for healthcare. So a living will is it's a document that you would create or develop when you are in your right mind. So you're of sound mind and body, you're in your right mind. And what the document says is when I'm no longer able to say what I want done for myself medically, this is what I want done for myself medically. That's a living will. A durable power of attorney for healthcare says when I'm no longer able to say what I want done for myself medically, I appoint this person, this healthcare proxy, to make those healthcare decisions for me. And it has to be a durable power of attorney for healthcare. Just because someone has a durable power of attorney for finance does not mean they can make healthcare decisions for you. If you want them to make healthcare decisions for you, you have to make them durable power of attorney for healthcare to make those healthcare decisions for you when you're no longer able to make those healthcare decisions for yourself. It's you can change it at any time. Say you make it your husband and then you all get a divorce and you don't want him to be your durable power of attorney anymore. You can always change it if you so choose. Okay, so these two we've talked about already, right? So negligence we said is care that falls below uh, the standard of care. So what the law says the standard of care is. So it's care that falls below that standard. And then malpractice is negligence by a professional person. So physician is a professional purpose. So if they uh, 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 do negligence or are convicted of negligence, then that's called malpractice. A lawyer is a professional person. So, if they are negligent, then that's malpractice. A nurse is a professional person. So if they, act negligently, then that's considered malpractice. So malpractice is negligence by a professional. And so remember, I said elements that need to be present to prove malpractice. You need those four elements present to prove malpractice. So first you have to prove that there was a duty. You had a duty to do something. Then you have to prove that there was a breach of that duty. Then you have to prove proximate cause or causation. And then you have to prove injury. right? So you got to prove that there was a duty, then you got to prove there's a breach of that duty, then you have to prove that there was injury, then you have to prove causation or proximate cause because of what you did that injury occurred or harm occurred. So defamation is when you say something against a person that causes damage to their reputation. You have two types of defamation: defamation of character, slander, which is oral defamation, so you verbally say something that damages a person's reputation, and then libel is written. You write something that damages a person's reputation. For example, you put something on Facebook, you write something on Facebook that damage a person's reputation. That could be considered defamation of character. Invasion of privacy is actually violating the confidential or privileged nature of a professional relationship. So you go into someone's belongings, or you go into maybe you go into their medical record, find out personal information. You weren't authorized to do that. You go in their room and find some personal information. You weren't authorized to do that, and then you publicly share that information um, or whatnot, um, and that leaves a person in a position that might cause a loss of dignity or embarrassment of some sort. Okay, false imprisonment is holding someone against his or her will. You're preventing them from leaving, you're restricting their movements. Now, this could be physical or chemical. So, chemical, if I medicate someone to the point that they um, don't have their faculties about themselves and can't move and can't do what they need to do, that's a chemical restraint. Physical restraint, I'm physically holding someone against their will. If I use restraints, that could be considered false imprisonment. Holding someone in a room against their will, that could be considered false imprisonment. So when we're talking about restraints, you got to be careful because with your you can't just go and use restraints just all willy-nilly. You have to have a doctor's order. You have to also show that you've tried everything else possible. That was your last resort, and they were going to physically harm themselves or physically harm somebody else or whatever. And that was your last resort. So you could be charged with false imprisonment, you know, for using restraints if you're not, taking the appropriate steps. Okay, so as a nurse, it's you are high risk for getting sued. People are sue happy now, So some things that you can do to decrease your legal risk, like I said before, maintain your competence, stay competent on on your skills, on your knowledge. Healthcare is constantly changing, so stay competent. Know your Nurse Practice Act. What does your state's Nurse Practice Act say you can and cannot do? Because, like I said, ignorance of the law is not a defense in a court of law. Get your continuing education hours in. You need 24 every year, but you can go above and beyond. You don't have to stop at that 24. So keep your skills up to date, keep your knowledge up to date. Um, Document, making sure you document well on your patient care. Your document should be accurate, it should be factual, it should be timely, right? Remember, we're not documenting your opinions. You're not going to document seems like, looks like, appears like. No, you're going to document the facts. Just state the facts. You want to document any interventions. If you identified a problem, what was your intervention? What was your patient's response? You're going to document any teaching that you've done as well. And what was that patient's response? Who did you teach? You want to be specific. Document um, um, physicians or other healthcare providers that you may have contacted. So document clearly. You want to establish a good rapport and good communication with your patient. You know, if they like you, maybe they're less likely to want to sue you, right? Um, Document incident reports. Remember, your incident reports are not a part of the patient's chart. So you're going to document your incident report, but then you're going to put it in a location wherever your facility says that location is. Maybe it's with the risk management person, but you follow your facility's policies as to where um, to put that incident report. You document it, but you put it wherever the facility says it goes. And so it's not going in the patient's chart. It's not a part of that patient's chart. And also when you're documenting your nurse's notes, obviously you're going to document what happened, but you're not going to document that you completed the incident report. You're not going to make reference to that incident report in your documentation. If an investigation comes up and they say, let me see the incident report, then you show it, but you don't make reference to it in your nurse's note. Also, making sure you're communicating effectively, using therapeutic communication, talking to your supervisor, talking to the family, talking to the patient, talking to other members of the healthcare team. Everybody communicating, making sure we're, providing the best level of care. Liability insurance is another thing that, some people, want to do. And take care of yourself, so that you're well rested and that you can function at your optimal level. So ethics in general is what's considered right or wrong. Um, you yourself have a personal code of ethics that guides you through life and what you feel is right or wrong and what you should or should not do. Nurses, as nurses, you're going to encounter a wide range of ethical issues or dilemmas in the practice of nursing. And so you might encounter conflicts that surround treatments, the goals, informed consent, um, technical advances in genetics. A lot of different things are ethical concerns. And so a lot of different things is going to determine how you're going to handle those ethical decisions. Are you aware of your nurse's code of ethics, which we'll discuss in a moment? Are you aware of the code of ethics for nurses? Are you knowledgeable about ethical principles and how to make ethical decisions and things like that? And so the code of ethics is voluntary. It's not like the law. The law is mandated, and you can have some penalties, if you break the law. Whereas ethics are voluntary, but they're a list of the code of ethics are voluntary, but they're things that you should be doing in nursing. And so we'll talk about those in a moment here. Okay, so the Code of Ethics for Nurses is developed by the American Nurses Association. And so it's a foundational document for the profession of nurses, right? So there's 9 provisions that the Code of Ethics documents. I have posted on Blackboard for you the Code of Ethics for Nurses with interpretive statements so that, to help you understand. But like I said, there are 9 provisions. So provision 1, the nurse practices with compassion and respect for the inherent dignity, worth, and unique attributes of every person. Provision 2, the nurse's primary commitment is to the patient, whether an individual, family, group, community, or population. Provision 3, the nurse promotes, advocates for, and protects the rights, health, and safety of the patient. Provision 4, the nurse has authority, accountability, and responsibility for nursing practice, makes decisions, and takes actions consistent with the obligation to promote health and provide optimal care. Provision 5, the nurse owes the same duties to self as to others, including the responsibility to promote health and safety, preserve wholeness of character and integrity, maintain competence, and continue personal and professional growth. Provision 6, the nurse, through individual and collective effort, establishes, maintains, and improves the ethical environment of the work setting and conditions of employment that are conducive to safe, quality health care. Provision 7, the nurse in all roles and settings advances the profession through research and scholarly inquiry, professional standards of development, and the generation of both nursing and health policy. Provision 8, the nurse collaborates with other healthcare professionals and the public to protect human rights, provide health diplomacy, and reduce health disparities. And provision 9, the profession of nursing collectively through its professional organizations must articulate nursing values, maintain the integrity of the profession, and integrate principles of social justice with the nursing into nursing and health policy. And the interpretive statements that I've posted on Blackboard for you, it goes into more detail for each of those provisions and shows you what each one elaborates more on what each one means for you as a nurse and what you should be doing as a nurse, respecting yourself, respecting your patients, respecting your colleagues, um, being advocates for your patients, all these things. These are considered ethics, are part of our code of ethics and things that we should be doing in the profession. And so they, like I said, they're different from the law. These guide us as nurses in what we should and shouldn't be doing, what's considered right and wrong, and helping us to make ethical decisions. Okay, so ethical dilemmas. These are just some ethical dilemmas you might encounter. Um, life prolonged treatment versus refusing such treatment. So, um, do I take this life prolonging treatment or do I refuse treatment? I've got cancer. Do I continue? Do I continue with the treatment? I'm so tired at this point. I'm tired. So that's an ethical dilemma. Initiating or terminating life support. That could be, an ethical dilemma. Assisted suicide. So, assisted suicide, if you have physician assisted suicide versus euthanasia, you have active or passive. Passive euthanasia is when you just stop all life-saving treatment. So you stop IV fluids, you stop tube feeds, you stop all life-saving measures, and eventually the person is going to pass away without those treatments. Versus active um, euthanasia. Active euthanasia is when the physician um, administers a lethal dose of something that's going to hasten a person's death. Whereas physician assisted suicide is where the physician orders a lethal dose of something and the person administers it to themselves. Now, these things are not legal in Ohio, but there are a handful of states in other states where you can go and this would be considered legal that you could do this. Some ethical terms I want you to think about in nursing. Beneficence. When we talk about our ethical principle, these are some ethical principles. Beneficence, that means doing good. So you do good for your patient. You take positive action for your patient. That could be things that you do. Maybe you sit and hold a dying patient's hand. Maybe you administer somebody pain medication to prevent them from being, in pain. So that's doing good for your patient. Whereas non-maleficence is do no harm. So that means you're going to do things that prevent harm from coming to your patient. You're going to test the water to ensure it's not too hot and don't burn them. You're going to follow your 6 rights of medication administration to ensure that the person receives the correct medication. You're going to do things to prevent harm from coming to your patient. Veracity. Veracity means you're being honest and truthful. So that means being honest and truthful, you know, um, at all times, no matter what. Fidelity, that just means keeping your promises. You're being faithful to your and keeping your promises to your patient. You're being faithful and keeping your promises to your job, your employer. You're being faithful and keeping your promises to the profession of nursing. Autonomy means respecting someone's self-determination. So self-determination and autonomy could mean the same thing. So that means the person has the right to make decisions without pressure or influence from you or anyone else. You provide the facts to that person and allow them to be able to make their own decisions. Justice means you're treating everyone fair and equal, no matter their disease, no matter their sexual orientation, no matter their lifestyles. If you don't agree with their lifestyles or whatever, you're going to treat everybody fair and equal the same. And then privacy and confidentiality is just respecting patient privacy and confidential um, information. Okay, question 3. Malpractice is negligence by a professional person. In other words, the person does not act according to professional standards of care as a reasonably prudent professional would under the same or similar circumstances. In order to prove malpractice, 4 elements must be present. Which of the following is not an element of malpractice? So the answer here is 1, defamation. Remember, I told you the 4 elements were you needed to have a duty, you needed to show a breach of that duty, you needed to show injury, and then you needed to show causation or proximate cause because what you did, this injury occurred.